Welcome to the deep dive. We know you want to get the important stuff fast without feeling totally overwhelmed.
Exactly, no fluff, just the core ideas.
So today we're tackling a really huge period, the Cold War and decolonization, basically from 1900 onwards, but really kicking off post-World War II.
It's a complex time, reshaped the entire globe. We're using the AP World History Unit 8 review materials as our framework.
Our mission, as always, is to pull out those key developments, the big ideas, and help understand why they still resonate today. We want you to get the main concepts.
Right, the big picture. Not every single date, but the major forces and changes.
Okay, let's set the scene. After World War I, lots of talk about self-government, but it didn't really pan out for many colonies.
No, the old empires largely held on. But then World War II happens, and everything changes. The traditional European powers, devastated.
And that created an opening, right, for the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Precisely. They emerged much stronger, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
They had distinct advantages, economically and technologically.
Let's break that down. Economic advantages first. The U.S.
Well, the U.S. mainland was untouched by the war's destruction. Its factories were running full tilt from wartime production.
So they had this massive industrial capacity ready to go.
Exactly. And then you have the Marshall Plan. Over $13 billion sent to help rebuild war-torn nations, mostly in Western Europe.
Which sounds generous, but it also boosted the U.S. economy and influence.
Oh, absolutely. It created markets for U.S. goods and solidified alliances. It was strategically brilliant, and it did help those European economies recover remarkably quickly.
Okay, and the Soviet Union, their economy was totally different, state-controlled.
Right. They'd pushed for rapid industrialization before the war. Huge country, lots of resources, big population. So they had a strong industrial base too, despite the immense human cost.
But that focus had downsides later.
Definitely. Prioritizing heavy industry and the military meant consumer goods were neglected. That created long-term weaknesses and popular discontent down the line.
So two very different economic engines powering these new superpowers. What about technology? The A-bomb looms large here.
It really does. The U.S. develops and uses the atomic bomb in 1945. Suddenly, there's this perception of overwhelming American technological dominance.
A game changer.
A total game changer. But the Soviets weren't sleeping. They poured resources into their own program and detonated their first atomic bomb in 1949. Much faster than the U.S. expected.
And that kicks off the arms race.
That's it. A dangerous, incredibly expensive competition to build bigger, better, more destructive weapons. First atomic bombs, then hydrogen bombs. It cemented the U.S. and USSR as the two poles of global power.
Okay, so superpower rivalry is heating up. At the same time, empires are starting to crumble. What's the link to decolonization?
Well, the process started simmering after World War I. Colonial troops fought. Wilson talked about self-determination. But then the mandate system felt like colonialism rebranded.
Right, hopes were raised, then dashed.
Exactly. But World War II is the real catalyst. Again, colonial populations were crucial to the war effort. They fought, often against the Axis powers, with a renewed expectation of freedom.
And this time, the imperial powers were too weak to say no.
They were economically shattered and militarily exhausted. They just didn't have the resources or the political will to maintain control in the face of rising nationalism and independence movements.
So the floodgates opened.
Pretty much. After 1945, you see something like 80 new states emerge.
Okay.
The map of the world fundamentally changed.
Okay, so this is the context. Two superpowers vying for dominance and dozens of new nations trying to find their footing. Perfect conditions for the Cold War.
Exactly. And it's crucial to remember, the Cold War wasn't a traditional war. No large-scale direct fighting between the U.S. and USSR.
It was more ideological.
Precisely. An ideological struggle, a battle for hearts and minds, fought through propaganda, economic competition, proxy wars, the space race, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation.
What were the core clashing ideas?
At its heart, it was U.S.-style democratic capitalism versus Soviet authoritarian communism.
Free markets and elections versus state control and a single party.
Right. The U.S. championed individual liberty, political participation, free markets. The Soviets emphasized state control of the economy, wealth redistribution, and prioritizing the collective over the individual, with no real political opposition allowed.
And both sides thought their system was the best for everyone.
That's key. They were both universalizing ideologies. Each believed their way was the future for the entire world, which naturally created tension and rivalry.
It's like competing operating systems for society.
A good analogy. And this ideological clash was fueled by deep mistrust. even stemming from their alliance during WWII.
Where did that mistrust really show up?
Conferences towards the end of the war, Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam, big disagreements, especially over Eastern Europe. The U.S. and Britain wanted free elections.
But Stalin had other ideas.
He wanted a buffer zone of friendly communist states to protect the Soviet Union from future invasion. So, communist governments were installed across Eastern Europe, often without free consent.
Which the West saw as a betrayal.
Absolutely, a violation of self-determination. Then there was the division of Germany into occupation zones. Stalin refused to give up control of East Germany.
Leading to Churchill's Iron Curtain speech.
Yes, describing that division of Europe, both physically and ideologically. The mistrust was baked in early on.
Okay, so mistrust and rival ideologies are fueling the Cold War. How does decolonization get tangled up in this? These new countries pop up.
And immediately become potential pawns or partners in the Cold War competition. Both the U.S. and the USSR raced to gain influence, offering aid, weapons, and political support.
Trying to pull them into their respective orbits.
Exactly. But these newly independent nations had just thrown off one form of foreign control. They weren't exactly eager to jump into bed with a new superpower.
They wanted their own path.
Many did. This desire led to the non-aligned movement. Think figures like Sukarno in Indonesia, Nkrumah in Ghana, Nasser in Egypt, Nehru in India.
When did that formally start?
The first major conference was in Bandung, Indonesia in 1955. 29 heads of state, mostly from Africa and Asia, representing nations that were newly independent or still fighting for it.
And their goal?
To resist pressure from both Washington and Moscow. To act as a sort of third bloc, focusing on their own development and interests, not getting dragged into the superpower conflict.
Could they really stay neutral, though? It must have been tough.
Extremely tough. Some leaders got very skilled at playing the superpowers off against each other, actually.
Oh, how so?
Well, they might accept economic aid from one side while getting military hardware from the other. Indonesia, for instance, got Soviet aid even while Sukarno was cracking down on Indonesia's own Communist Party. It was a delicate balancing act.
Clever maneuvering. So the Cold War isn't just U.S. versus USSR, it's shaping everything, including how these new nations operate. What about direct Cold War structures, like military alliances?
Those solidified the divide. You had the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe, effectively under Moscow's control. The West responded with NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949.
A mutual defense pact.
Right. An attack on one member is considered an attack on all. The Soviets formalized their own alliance later with the Warsaw Pact in 1955. So Europe was clearly divided into two armed camps.
And alongside these alliances, the nuclear threat was escalating.
Dramatically. After both sides got the atomic bomb, they raced to develop the much more powerful hydrogen bomb. The U.S. tested theirs in '52, the Soviets in '53.
Leading to that terrifying concept, SMAID.
Mutual assured destruction. The idea was that both sides had so many nuclear weapons capable of surviving a first strike that any nuclear attack would inevitably lead to the attacker's own destruction and retaliation.
A balance of terror.
Essentially, yes, a very unstable balance. And it almost tipped over during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
That was the really close call, wasn't it?
The closest we ever came to full-scale nuclear war. The U.S. discovered Soviet nuclear missile sites being built in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This was after the failed U.S.-backed Bay of Pigs invasion attempt in '61.
So Kennedy responded how?
He imposed a naval blockade or quarantine around Cuba to prevent more missiles from arriving. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Tense negotiations, back-channel communications.
But eventually.
Both sides backed down. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba, and secretly, an agreement to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey.
Wow. That must have scared everyone.
It did. It really brought home the reality of the nuclear threat. It led to some efforts to control the arms race like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty signed in 1968, aimed at preventing the spread of nuclear weapons.
So direct war was avoided, thankfully, but the superpowers fought indirectly.
Yes, through proxy wars. These were local conflicts where the U.S. and USSR supported opposing sides, essentially using other countries as battlegrounds for their ideological struggle.
Like Korea?
The Korean War, 1950-53, is a classic example. After WWII, Korea was divided. The Communist North, backed by the Soviets and later China, invaded the South. The U.S. led a UN force to defend the South.
And the result?
A brutal stalemate, millions dead, and Korea remains divided to this day, along roughly the same line.
Any other major examples?
The Angolan Civil War is another. After Angola won independence from Portugal in 1975, different ethnic and political groups fought for control. The U.S., USSR, Cuba, and South Africa all got involved, backing different sides, a long, devastating conflict.
And in Latin America?
The Contra War in Nicaragua in the 1980s, the leftist Sandinista government took power, receiving Soviet and Cuban support. The U.S. funded and trained the anti-communist Contra rebels. Very bloody, lots of human rights abuses. Eventually ended with a ceasefire and elections.
So these proxy wars spread the Cold War's violence across the globe. Let's shift focus slightly to communism's spread, especially in China. That was a huge development.
Massive. Remember, China had its revolution back in 1911, overthrowing the emperor. But what followed was instability, warlords, and a struggle between the Nationalist Party and the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong.
They fought a civil war.
Yes, interrupted by the Japanese invasion during WWII, but it resumed afterwards. The Communists, with significant popular support and some Soviet aid, eventually defeated the Nationalists in 1949. Mao proclaimed the People's Republic of China.
And Mao implemented communist policies.
He did. Nationalized industry, redistributed land initially. This land reform was less violent than in the Soviet Union. But then came the great leap forward in the late 1950s.
What was that?
Mao's ambitious plan to rapidly industrialize China, focusing on collectivized agriculture and small-scale rural industries, like backyard steel furnaces.
How did that work out?
Disastrously. The steel produced was often useless. Agricultural collectivization combined with bad weather and misguided policies led to a horrific famine. Estimates range from 20 to maybe 50 million deaths. Mao even refused foreign aid.
A catastrophe. So China's path was communist, but distinct from the Soviet model.
Very distinct, especially with Mao's focus on the peasantry and rural areas, contrasting with the more urban focus in the Soviet Union. Their relationship actually soured later on.
Okay. Besides China, where else did we see significant socialist or communist movements taking hold during this period? Let's do a quick rundown. Egypt.
Under Gamal Abdel Nasser, after the 1952 revolution, he nationalized the Suez Canal, leading to the Suez Crisis. He implemented socialist reforms, got Soviet support, became a leader in the non-aligned movement.
Ethiopia.
A military coup in 1974 overthrew the emperor. Mengistu Haile Mariam established a brutal socialist state backed by the Soviets. Land redistribution, but also famine and economic failure.
Vietnam.
Declared independence after WWII, but the French tried to retake control. Led to war, division into Communist North under Ho Chi Minh, who also implemented land redistribution, and an anti-communist South, which of course led to the much larger Vietnam War.
India. Any socialist influence there?
India adopted a mixed economy after independence, with significant state planning. Land reform was attempted, with varying success. The state of Kerala had a particularly noted Land Reforms Act that helped tenants.
What about Iran?
Iran's history in this period is complex. There was an Anglo-Soviet invasion during WWII, then a nationalist movement briefly took power in 1951, nationalizing oil. But a CIA-backed coup in '53 installed the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi.
And the Shah.
He pushed modernization with his White Revolution, including some land redistribution, but his rule was autocratic and faced growing opposition, eventually leading to the 1979 Islamic Revolution.
And finally, Cuba.
Fidel Castro led a revolution overthrowing the U.S.-backed dictator Batista between 1952 and 1959. He established a communist state, redistributed land, nationalized U.S. assets. This led to U.S. hostility, the Bay of Pigs invasion attempt, and pushed Cuba firmly into the Soviet camp.
So a real variety of movements, some successful, some leading to disaster, all influenced by the Cold War context. Now, back to decolonization itself. How did countries actually get independent? Was it always through fighting?
Not always. There were broadly two paths: negotiated independence and armed struggle.
Where did negotiation work?
Often in places with smaller European settler populations. India is a prime example. Decades of nationalist organizing by the Indian National Congress and Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance, think the homespun movement, the Salt March, put immense pressure on Britain.
And Britain was weakened after WWII.
Exactly. They lacked the resources and will to hold on. So independence came in 1947 through negotiation, though tragically accompanied by partition.
Other examples of negotiations.
The Gold Coast, led by Kwame Nkrumah. He negotiated with Britain, leading to independence as Ghana in 1957. Much of French West Africa also gained independence through negotiation by around 1959 as French control weakened.
But negotiation wasn't always possible, especially with large settler populations.
Right. Where large numbers of Europeans had settled and considered the colony their home, they often fiercely resisted independence for the indigenous majority. This usually led to violence.
Algeria being a key case.
Definitely. Algeria had over 1 million French settlers. The Algerian National Liberation Front, FLN, fought a long, brutal war against the French military from 1954. Extreme violence on both sides.
How did it end?
Charles de Gaulle, realizing the war was unwinnable and tearing France apart, eventually negotiated Algerian independence in 1962.
Other violent struggles.
Angola's war for independence against Portugal was violent, and as we mentioned, it immediately spilled into a civil war that became a Cold War proxy fight. Independence came in 1975 after a coup in Portugal itself. Vietnam's fight against the French, the First Indochina War, was also an armed conflict leading to French defeat and division.
Even Egypt, while technically independent earlier, had the Suez Crisis in '56 when Nasser nationalized the British and French-controlled canal.
Right, that involved military action by Britain, France, and Israel. Though they were forced to withdraw under U.S. and Soviet pressure, it asserted Egyptian sovereignty.
A major tragic problem arising from decolonization was the issue of borders, wasn't it?
A huge problem. Colonial powers drew boundaries for administrative convenience, often lumping together rival ethnic or religious groups or splitting groups apart. These artificial borders became major sources of conflict after independence.
The partition of India is the most horrific example.
Sadly, yes. The Muslim League, fearing marginalization in a Hindu-majority India, demanded a separate state, Pakistan. When the British granted independence in 1947, they partitioned the subcontinent along religious lines.
Leading to chaos.
Unimaginable chaos and violence. Massive migrations, perhaps 12 million people displaced. Estimates of the dead range from 500,000 to over 1 million. And it created the ongoing conflict over Kashmir, claimed by both India and Pakistan, leading to war almost immediately.
Were there similar issues elsewhere?
Yes, many places. In Canada, you had the Quebecois separatist movement seeking independence for French-speaking Quebec. In Nigeria, which gained independence from Britain, ethnic tensions exacerbated by colonial boundaries led to the Biafra secessionist movement.
Nigerian Civil War.
Right, 1967, 1970. The Igbo people tried to form the Independent Republic of Biafra. It was brutally suppressed by the Nigerian federal government. A terrible example of the legacy of those imposed colonial borders.
So these new states are born often into conflict because of these borders.
Exactly. Conflict and displacement were tragically common. We mentioned India-Pakistan. The creation of Israel is another profound example.
How did that unfold?
You had the Zionist movement advocating for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, growing Jewish migration, especially after the Holocaust. The British, who controlled Palestine under a mandate, had made conflicting promises. Arab populations resisted displacement. The UN proposed a partition plan in 1947.
Which led to war.
Immediately. Israel declared independence in 1948, and neighboring Arab states attacked. It resulted in Israeli victory, but also the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, creating a refugee crisis and an ongoing conflict that continues to this day.
And Southeast Asia?
Cambodia gained independence from France in 1953. But after years of instability and the Vietnam War spilling over, the brutal Khmer Rouge regime under Pol Pot took power in 1975.
Infamous for genocide.
Horrifically so. They implemented a radical communist agrarian society, leading to the deaths of perhaps 2 million Cambodians through execution, starvation, and overwork. Vietnam invaded in 1978, eventually withdrew, and Cambodia only held its first free elections in the early 1990s after decades of trauma.
So, immense challenges. Beyond conflict, how did these new states manage their economies? Was there a common trend?
A very common trend was strong government involvement in the economy. Many leaders believed state intervention was necessary to overcome colonial legacies and promote development.
Like Nasser in Egypt.
Yes, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Besides nationalizing the Suez Canal, he undertook big projects like the Aswan High Dam with Soviet help, implemented land reform, and expanded social welfare like free schooling.
Indira Gandhi in India.
Indira Gandhi continued India's path of socialist-inspired five-year plans. She nationalized major banks and industries, regulated the economy, and oversaw the Green Revolution, which increased food production. Mixed results, but definitely state-led.
Others?
Julius Nyerere in Tanzania pushed socialist policies known as Ujamaa, focusing on cooperative agriculture, trying to achieve self-reliance, though largely unsuccessfully. Sirmavo Bandaranaike in Sri Lanka, the world's first female prime minister, also implemented socialist policies like land reform and nationalization, facing significant economic struggles.
So a strong state role was common. Another post-colonial phenomenon was migration, wasn't it? People moving from former colonies to the imperial centers.
Yes, significant migrations to the metropoles, the former colonial powers.
Why did that happen?
Colonialism created links. People from the colonies often knew the colonizers' language, culture, and institutions. After independence, economic opportunities, established family connections, or instability back home drew many people to places like Britain, France, or the Netherlands.
Exactly.
South Asians moving to Britain, Algerians and West Africans to France, Filipinos to the United States, which had its own colonial history.
And this changed the metropoles.
Absolutely. It transformed them into much more multi-ethnic, multicultural societies. It also maintained cultural and economic ties between the former colonies and colonizers, though often in complex and unequal ways.
Okay, this entire era is defined by struggle against colonial powers, between superpowers within new nations. Let's look at methods of resistance. Nonviolence was incredibly powerful.
Hugely influential. Mohandas Gandhi in India is the prime example. His philosophy of nonviolent civil disobedience, satyagraha, was central to India's independence movement.
Specific tactics.
The homespun movement, boycotting British textiles to promote Indian self-sufficiency. The Salt March, defying the British salt monopoly. These acts directly challenged British economic control and galvanized mass support, making continued rule untenable.
And his influence spread.
Massively. Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States explicitly drew inspiration from Gandhi for the civil rights movement against racial segregation. He used boycotts, like the Montgomery bus boycotts, sit-ins, marches, all forms of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience, facing arrests and violence, but ultimately achieving major legal changes.
Nelson Mandela, too.
Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, ANC, initially advocated nonviolence against apartheid in South Africa, boycotts, strikes. However, after the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, where police killed peaceful protesters, the ANC shifted towards armed struggle alongside continued political action.
But Mandela ultimately became a symbol of reconciliation.
Yes, after 27 years in prison, his release and eventual election as president marked the end of apartheid, achieved through a combination of internal resistance, international pressure, and negotiation. A testament to perseverance.
So nonviolence had a huge impact. But there was also intense violent resistance and state repression.
Sadly, yes. Many states, both old and new, used violence to maintain power or suppress opposition. Think of Chile under Augusto Pinochet, after the U.S.-backed coup overthrew the elected Marxist president Salvador Allende in 1973. Thousands were killed, tortured, or disappeared.
Franco's Spain.
For Francisco Franco's fascist regime in Spain, which came to power after the brutal Spanish Civil War, systematically suppressed Republicans, communists, anarchists, and regional separatists like the Catalans and Basques for decades, though armed resistance groups like ETA persisted.
And Idi Amin in Uganda.
Idi Amin, who took power in a military coup in 1971, became notorious as the Butcher of Uganda. His regime unleashed horrific violence against specific ethnic groups and political opponents. Estimates suggest hundreds of thousands, maybe close to 1 million, were killed.
This era also saw the rise of the military-industrial complex.
Yes, President Eisenhower warned about it in the U.S. The Cold War arms race led to massive military buildups in both the U.S. and USSR. Powerful industries became dependent on defense spending, creating economic interests vested in continued conflict or preparation for it.
And violence wasn't just state-sponsored. We saw the rise of non-state groups using violence against civilians. Terrorism.
Exactly. Terrorism, the use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, for political aims. Peru had the Shining Path, a brutal Maoist revolutionary group led by Abimael Guzman. They waged a terrorist campaign aiming to overthrow the government, causing tens of thousands of deaths before Guzman's capture.
And Al-Qaeda.
Al-Qaeda, founded by Osama bin Laden, a militant Islamist group with grievances against U.S. foreign policy and presence in the Middle East. They targeted civilians, most infamously in the September 11th attacks in the U.S., killing nearly 3,000 people. This, in turn, led to decades of increased U.S. military involvement in the Middle East.
A truly devastating legacy. Okay, after decades of tension, proxy wars, and near misses, how did the Cold War finally end? It seemed almost sudden.
Several factors converged in the 1980s. The sheer cost of the arms race was crippling, especially for the Soviet Union. Remember MAD and the massive nuclear arsenals?
There was a brief thaw in the 70s, detente.
Yes, some arms control treaties like SALT-I were signed. But then things got tense again in the early 80s. U.S. President Ronald Reagan took a much harder line against the Soviets.
He called them the evil empire.
He did. He also massively increased U.S. military spending. and proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, popularly known as Star Wars, a space-based missile defense system.
Was it feasible?
Highly questionable technologically and incredibly expensive. But Reagan believed the Soviets would try to match the spending to keep up, and that their already struggling economy couldn't handle it.
Pushing them towards economic collapse.
That was part of the strategy. And the Soviets were facing deep economic problems. Added to that was their disastrous war in Afghanistan.
They invaded in 1979.
Yes, to prop up a communist government there. But they got bogged down fighting U.S., Saudi, and Pakistani-backed Mujahideen rebels in a brutal, unwinnable guerrilla war. It lasted 9 years, cost a fortune in money and lives, and became their Vietnam.
So, economic strain, military overreach, and then a new leader in the Soviet Union.
The crucial element, Mikhail Gorbachev, who came to power in 1985. He recognized the Soviet system was in crisis, stagnant economy, limited trade, agricultural failures, growing discontent, especially in Eastern Europe like the earlier Prague Spring showed.
And he introduced reforms.
Major reforms. Perestroika, meaning economic restructuring, allowing some market mechanisms and reducing central planning. And glasnost, meaning openness, allowing more public discussion, dissent, and criticism of the government.
That must have opened the floodgates.
It did. He also made a critical decision. The Soviet Union would no longer use military force to keep communist governments in power in Eastern Europe.
So the Brezhnev Doctrine was over.
Effectively, yes. And people seized the opportunity. Democratic reform movements swept across Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia.
And the ultimate symbol, the Berlin Wall.
The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 was electrifying. East Germany opened the border. People swarmed across, chipping away at the wall. It symbolized the end of the division of Europe and the imminent collapse of Soviet control. Germany reunified shortly after.
And the Soviet Union itself.
Glasnost unleashed long-suppressed nationalist sentiments within the Soviet republics. One after another declared independence. Finally, in December 1991, the Soviet legislature voted to dissolve the Soviet Union itself. The Cold War was officially over.
Wow, what a cascade of events. So looking back at this whole period, if we're thinking about cause and effect.
For the Cold War, the long-term causes were definitely that fundamental ideological conflict and the mutual mistrust built up during and after WWII. Short-term, things like the disagreements at Yalta and Potsdam, the Iron Curtain speech, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, all escalated tension.
And the effects.
The proxy wars, the nuclear arms race in Medan, the space race, the division of the world into alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and the counterreaction of the non-aligned movement.
And for decolonization.
Long-term causes were rising nationalism, anti-imperialist ideas, and decades of local resistance movements. Short-term, the critical factor was the weakening of European powers after WWII, combined with the Cold War context, where superpowers sometimes supported independence movements for strategic reasons.
Effects of decolonization.
The creation of dozens of new nations, obviously, but also the huge variation in how independence was achieved, negotiated versus violent, the immense struggles with political stability, economic development, and often conflict fueled by those colonial borders, and, as we saw, constant interference or influence attempts due to the Cold War.
So it's impossible to separate them, really. The Cold War and decolonization profoundly shaped each other and the world that emerged.
Absolutely. They are the twin forces that define the second half of the 20th century, creating the global landscape we inherited. Understanding their interplay is crucial.
It really is. These events set the stage for so many of the challenges and dynamics we see today.
No doubt about it. The legacies are everywhere.
All right. That brings us to the end of this deep dive. Thinking about that legacy, considering everything we've discussed, the redrawn map, the ideological battles, the economic shifts, the conflicts, what do you think is one of the most significant ongoing global challenges today that can really be traced directly back to this Cold War and decolonization era? Something for our listeners to ponder.
That's a great question to leave people with. There are certainly many contenders.
Definitely gives you a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us for this exploration.